If you could you please give us a brief summary of the thesis of the book so we can get into some of the details? I'd be interested to hear about the dueling constitutions and such. And so, help us just understand where we're going, and then let's get into the questions.
Right. I would say, in the simplest sense, the book doesn't really have a thesis. It's a narrative. It's basically the story of the country, from the assassination of Kennedy to the election of Trump. And it talks about a lot of elements of things that have changed in the country, the role of the Vietnam War, the role of feminism, that kind of thing. But there is one, let's say, theory that runs through the book, and I would say is at the heart of the book, which is that a lot of the politics of today has to do with some elements of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that perhaps people didn't see, or that perhaps have changed over time. I think it's fair to say that there were, for all the good that act did, and for all the admirable motivations that it has evolved in ways that have caused great problems for the country. Basically, in 1964, the country was confronted with what it thought was kind of a local problem. That is segregation in the deepest part of the Deep South. Outside of the South, and this is something that I think that opinion polls from the time show quite clearly, most Americans did not feel that the issue of racism and segregation really concerned them at all. They almost looked at the South as kind of a foreign policy problem. In the border South, there was segregation. There was also progress. I think that people were looking primarily at Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and seeing horrible scenes of, of people having fire hoses and dogs turned on them at demonstrations, and they wanted it to stop. And I think that there was a consensus in the country, particularly after Kennedy died, and particularly after Lyndon Johnson portrayed civil rights as John F. Kennedy's noblest aspiration. There was a consensus in the country to do this. But it was a tricky thing to do. I mean, one of the things I say in the book is that this has always been considered a problem in the United States. There has never been a year of American history in which the race problem has not been considered a problem. The reason that nothing had been done about it until 1964 is that it was a very difficult thing to do. And it was a difficult thing to do in large part because the South was a democracy. Now, nowadays you'd say, well, some democracy where, people have to fill out a literacy test to vote, or, you can say that it was, you can call it a bad democracy. You can call it a sham democracy, but it was a democracy. And in order to undo the laws of Jim Crow, it meant overturning a democracy. Now, if there were a way to limit that overturning of democracy to sort of Alabama and Mississippi, we would not be having this conversation today. What happened, though, is that the Civil Rights Act was framed in very general terms, and it was very strong medicine. It allowed you to basically overturn court verdicts. It allowed you to rewrite the election laws of affected states. It allowed you to overturn what people understood as being matters of freedom of association. It did many things, and it was not in its text limited to race. And so the application of the civil rights laws began to spread. It covered sex, it covered immigrant status. And so as time moved on, people began to notice, wait a minute, I don't live in the South, and yet my children are getting bused to schools. Why are kids in Louisville, which is a border South state, and Boston, to take two of the sort of like serious places, why did they have to have their children bused to school? What did that have to do with Alabama and Mississippi? And so it spread geographically. It spread in terms of who was affected. So women who felt their careers thwarted, say, in a corporation, would say, I think there ought to be more women in positions of authority in this corporation. And people would say, well, it's up to the corporation. And the women would say, well, I think there ought to be a law. When someone said, well, go tell the state house and try and pass a law. And the women would say, no, I don't want that. I don't want to get my rights that way by going to the state house and passing a law. I want that same emergency plan to get me the rights now that blacks got in 1964, because my situation as a woman or as an immigrant or as a Spanish speaker or eventually as a disabled person or a gay person or a transgender person, my situation, they would say, is analogous to that situation that black people were undergoing in the early 60s. And so you had a situation where it was spreading geographically. It was spreading in terms of who got affected with it. And finally, it was spreading in intensity. Okay, so you had much more serious remedies than you had when the legislation was first passed. You had, when 1964, no one envisioned affirmative action. There was a word affirmative action, but no one envisioned it as a source of quotas, let alone the sort of like the talk of equity that we have today. There's really a lot that the government can do if you run a business, say, or if you're just going about your business. There's a lot that government can do to you for a lot of different reasons. And so what you had was basically the introduction of this second constitution, as I say, which was authorized in the name of this great moral emergency to overrule the first. And that's why, people would be voting for things and they wouldn't happen. In California, there was a vote to deny benefits to illegal immigrants in the 1990s. Regardless of what you think of that vote, it is the way laws are passed in the state of California, and it passed by, I think, 5 million votes. Yet you had a judge sort of who, as soon as the election started to become law, who said, nope, that you can't do that. One judge in the name of this second constitution. So that generally, I think that's what you're looking for when you say a thesis. I wouldn't call it a thesis, but it is the style of government, which is that's what this book describes.
Thank you for that. When we talk about forced desegregation and busing, that really hits home for me. In my own childhood experiences, I was bused from the suburbs of a small Indiana town into the inner city of Fort Wayne, Indiana. And I very clearly remember leaving my neighborhood friends behind and getting on a bus and being shipped from the suburbs into the city, from flower beds and suburbs into the cracked sidewalks and empty lots of the city, and thrown into what was truly a scientific experiment that no one had ever conducted. And it introduced me very early on to the differences between the way different folks lived and race conflict. And it seems crazy to me today if someone would suggest that we're going to compel parents parents to send their kids to a school far all the way across town in the name of some grand social experiment.